Ladies and gentlemen, it's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID Livestream, Series 16, the finale of Series 16, Episode 6, which means we're at episode number 96 in the aggregate. Starts here. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me apologize. We are coming to you this evening on a recorded broadcast. That's simply because, well, where we're sitting today, the flow internet is not flowing. So due to problems that we've had as a result of storms that took place a while ago and the fact that they can't seem to manage to wire the cable together, we're living in hope, and fingers crossed all round, that the good folks of Flow will give us a proper connection in the near future and we'll be able to do our live shows once again. Feeling that at least we'll be live when we get to Boca in a few weeks' time. So what's been happening in the course of the last week? Well, actually, probably lots of things have been happening since we recorded this show, but certainly one highlight I noticed was how interesting it is that the Moscow exchange took another body blow during the course of the last week or so, because, of course, President Zelensky signed the decree for sanctions against the Moscow exchange, the Ukrainian exchange, delivering a final stab in the back of a virtual sanctions nature to the Russian exchange, which, let's face it, until 2014 to 2016 was actually a major shareholder in the Ukrainian exchange itself, although, of course, it has no longer been invested since 2016. Something else you might like to look at, ladies and gentlemen, which fortunately is far away from the horrible ravages of the war in Ukraine caused by President Putin's invasion. Over in the Middle East, the Dubai International Financial Center, DIFC, they've announced some really groovy, interesting potential regulation. That is, they're going to try and regulate venture studios. They've put it out for consultation. You can go to the DIFC site now and check on it, and therefore hopefully get your comments in. We're really pro-venture studio. We've worked on a few ourselves and actually continue to work on another interesting project or two in the venture studio space as I speak. Of course, our concern is, might the risk be overly prescriptive regulation? Presumably, we'll find time to manage to get our own feedback in there to the DIFC in due course. But of course, what does a venture studio in a financial center say to us? Technological innovation. And that in many ways leads into a lot of the theme of today's show. The topic is Jeffrey Kutler's journey from ATMs to cryptocurrencies. Jeffrey Kutler's journalistic career has seen quite the arc. He happens to be an award-winning journalist based in New York, and his career, well, good grief, it's gone all the way from the mass adoption of ATMs, automated teller machines in the banking industry, through the growth of technology to the announcement that actually this was fintech. And most recently, he's witnessed the rise of cryptocurrencies, distributed ledger, and indeed, he's seen every other technological in-between in the banking and financial space. Jeff is, as I mentioned, an award-winning journalist and contributing editor to the TabbFORUM. He's also a contributing editor of the Global Association of Risk Professionals, GARP's risk intelligence site. Indeed, Jeffrey served as editor-in-chief with GARP from 2008 through 2019. And before joining GARP, he had senior editorial roles at a multiplicity of major names in the financial markets and banking editorial space, including Institutional Investor, Securities Industry News, I should say, in the singular, and American Banker. Jeff, it's lovely to see you today. Thank you for joining the show. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you, Patrick. I am in Brooklyn, New York, USA, where I live and work.
Brooklyn, New York. What a magnificent place. So how long have you actually been working from home at this point in time, Jeff, if that's not too rude a question to ask you? Was it before COVID, during COVID, or?
Slightly before, all during, and since. It's now the default way of my working. And to tell you the truth, it's better than going to the office every day.
Well, it certainly involves a great deal of commuting, doesn't it? Which is really quite pleasant, and that's got to be a joy. I think, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I have the luxury of focusing on the journalism that I love to do, so I'm not complaining.
It's certainly much better than worrying about anything that might be a foible in New York's excellent, but nonetheless not always absolutely perfect metropolitan transit system, which, like all major cities, has got a problem when you put 6, 10, 15 million people in a major urban zone, right?
That's correct. I think they're saying now that the capacity or the ridership is back up to 60 or 65% of what it was pre-COVID, which is a lot of progress. And also, I guess the advantage is it's not so overcrowded most of the time, but they do have a revenue issue.
Yeah, revenue issue is a huge thing as well with the London Underground. But of course, and also one of the problems is that, I mean, the New York metropolitan transit system is mostly quite old by the comparison of these sorts of railways. Not as old as some of the London Underground, but nonetheless dating back quite a bit. So in that respect, it's always difficult. So tell me, how did you get into the world of financial journalism in the first place?
Well, I was interested in a journalism path at a pretty early age. But what really got me into it professionally was a college job. I guess you'd call it an internship, where I was hired. It happened to be by a future employer, American Banker. That was in the 1970s. After I graduated from college a couple of years after that stint, I went to work for American Banker and was exposed to various interesting developments in banking of that time. 1970s was a period of inflation and stagnation and a lot of debt and international banking crises that were brewing. But I got into covering what they called payment systems and electronic banking. And I was there, I think it was about, it was in the late 60s. You mentioned ATMs, the late 60s. That was a late 60s invention. And I think the UK gets credit for the first cash dispensing machines. But a decade after that, they started to become widespread in the United States. And I happened to cover a major breakthrough, which was by one bank, Citibank, 1977-78. They decided every branch should have a pair of ATMs. And that was a big breakthrough for that technology.
It's incredible when you think about it. I mean, the UK at the moment, we've got this situation where they've been raving in the news recently because I think it is, I'm trying to remember, I think it's HSBC or possibly Barclays, have actually got 2 bank branches that are completely cashless. And there's a near uproar because if you pop into one of the bank branches, I think it's at King's Cross, you actually can't get any cash whatsoever out of the facility, which would have been unthinkable to the world in 1977, let alone the late 1960s when these machines were first trialed.
Yeah, not to jump ahead too much, but there is such a thing as cryptocurrency or Bitcoin ATMs now. I think that's mainly a lark, but we've come kind of full circle with all these advances in money and banking and payments. There's a lot of discussion now about, I think it is Sweden as one of the countries where they're capable of going completely cashless. The technology is there. The population is that much accepting of the technology, but it raises questions about equity and access for all and freedoms of choice. And even here in New York, there's stores that want to open up cashless, and they're now being told by the nanny staters that they can't do so because it excludes too many people who want to stay wedded to the cash system. I don't think we'll ever get rid of cash, by the way.
Yes, I'm in the same book. And I mean, as you know, I've been very much in the forefront of a lot of these things to do with capital market revolutions and encouraging electronic money and so on. But it's very interesting because a lot of people think cash always goes away, whereas I just think it never goes away. But it probably does decline in interest. And yes, you're right. There was an excellent article, I think, just a couple of months ago in The Spectator in the UK, which was the decline of the Swedish bank robber, because there's actually no point in raiding a bank anymore because you won't get any cash. And if you do, you probably can't spend it anyway because it's going to be so difficult. It'll be so easy to find the money. Yeah.
Yes, I thank Exchange Invest newsletter, which I read regularly, for seeing that link. Historically, a lesson I learned early on was you can layer on new payment systems all you want, but the ones that they are replacing never go away. There's still barter taking place in various parts of the world and in various forms. And they were not abolished by advanced money or more convenient forms of coin and currency. And I don't think any payments revolution is going to eliminate whatever generation of payments went before.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, it's much like technology. You look at it, I mean, at the moment, the United States of America has seen an explosion in the course of the last few years in ham radio licenses, where lots of people are very interested in shortwave radio, a technology which really makes no sense whatsoever in many respects in the digital age, but nonetheless is seeing a lot of people who are going to be enthusiastic about it. And you look at the equestrian economy, where, okay, day to day, the number of working horses is, well, pretty few in number, but the number of people who are interested in equestrian activities as a sport is huge. And I think actually we're going to have a great show coming up in a few weeks' time. We're going to be talking about coins and money with one of the leading lights of the Malta Numismatic Society, precisely because it's just such an interesting area. So indeed, so you were around Citibank, or at least you were around at the time. Citibank are putting in 2 ATMs into every bank branch at that point in 1977, 78. They announced that. And therefore, how long did you stay with American Banker, and what else did you find to write about as technology started to ratchet up?
I stayed with American Banker in that first stint for only about 5 or 6 years. And I went to work for a consulting outfit that no longer exists, but that hired me to put together a newsletter for them. I came back to American Banker a couple of years later. By then, we were in the mid-1980s. And a big event in the banking and payments world at the time was ATMs were no longer proprietary, that networks were being formed and interchanges between banks were allowing you to use an ATM anywhere. That part of the revolution happened pretty quickly, but it was a major change in behavior for the banking industry, especially in places like the US, which is rather fragmented historically. Geographically, banks historically were confined to a state or a geographical region, and we got around to interstate branching, interstate banking, and now you can't tell the difference really. Banks are as common as fast food places all over the country. ATMs are a commodity, but there were other developments. The ability to use your ATM card as debit cards at the point of sale, that was once a new thing. Even if you step back a little bit, I was thinking about this earlier, in the context of financial innovation. It was a really big deal when checks became paper checks, which of course haven't yet been fully displaced, became machine readable with magnetic ink characters on the across the bottom of the check document. That allowed the industry to get beyond manual handling, and machines read at pretty much 98, 99% accuracy rate what was on the check.
That was an incredible moment, actually, when you think about it, because also, as I remember, there were a few fascinating libertarian individuals in the course of the last 20 years who were protesting wildly because the banks would not accept them just writing their own checks with all the appropriate data, which actually technically was still legal, if I remember correctly, at least in some states, that you could actually just draw up your own check and sign it and then have it presented to the bank. But obviously, people had to get commoditized because of machine readability, which, yes, all of that sort of fascinating stuff of the mid-70s that was very old, clunky, and expensive, and only available for big institutions, like electronic petrol pumps that we talked about with Colin Howard, who was a guest on this show, good grief, about 80, 90 episodes ago. It really started to revolutionize life out of the analog.
Convenience stores, petrol stations, they all had supermarkets. They all had a lot to do with the spread of electronic payments. There were, I guess you see this in the progression of any innovations. There are always old school people who question whether we should go there. And I remember in a conference that I attended, I can't place the year exactly, but there was a bit of industry backlash against some of the more fanciful experiments in remote banking and the use of cards and direct deposits and things like that. And a guy got up at a conference and he said, wouldn't this be an amazing thing if you could just take out a piece of paper, write a payee on it and an amount of dollars, sign it and give it to that person, and it will work as money? So I guess if you go back far enough, this industry's been innovating continuously. And I'm also recalling a comment made by the late Mr. Paul Volcker,
yep,
who has a impeccable reputation as a central banker. But in his latter years, after the mess of the global financial crisis in 08-09, there were a lot of questions about so-called financial innovation and had it gotten too far off course. Certain financial engineering activities were being blamed for the excesses of the crisis. And Volcker said publicly that there hadn't been a great financial industry innovation since ATMs. He got some backlash for that, but he was trying to make a point.
I think he makes quite a good point, because the one thing about an ATM was that it genuinely radically changed the perspective for everyone, because whether you were a business or whether you were an individual, it wholly changed your relationship to money, because you no longer had to queue in a bank branch for perhaps minutes or hours, and you no longer had the same degree of danger because you weren't carrying cash, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, obviously card fraud and so on remains an issue to this day, but the ATM really did revolutionize the ability for people to manage to get in control of their own money in so many ways, and paved the way for the modern banking application that's on our cell phones and so on. So you spent 5-6 years with ABA, with American Banker, and then where did you go next in your career?
My next big move happened in, I guess it was the turn of the century, 2000. I went to work for Institutional Investor, which still is a major institutional buy-side focused magazine. They're now publishing online, but it was very much a paper product when I was there, and tremendous reputation and following on Wall Street. Had a tradition of excellent journalism and some investigative reporting, and it carved a niche that didn't really exist before it existed, which was 20 years before I got there. So we had the opportunity to make more of a statement in terms of technology in the financial markets. And among the things we accomplished after I joined in 2000, which was very timely, it was the dot-com crash. But be that as it may, early 2000, we launched the first of a series of annual rankings where we spotlighted leaders in the world of what became known later as fintech. But we spotlighted 30 or 40 people per year who were doing innovative things in financial technology, particularly in the capital markets, but also in the retail markets. And we grew that feature from there. It wasn't just about executives of major financial market institutions. We also got into the trading technology space, where people who were innovating and beginning to apply all that great internet era technology to trading, they got their spotlight in what we call the trading technology 40, I think it was. And when fintech started taking off just after the financial crisis, we focused on what we called fintech finance, or the people, individuals and firms in venture capital, in private equity, in strategic investing within large financial institutions who were pushing the envelope in terms of investing in the emerging fintech space. So that way I got exposure to all the stuff that really is flowering now.
Fascinating publication, Institutional Investor, of course, founded by Gilbert E. Kaplan, who, amongst other wondrous eccentricities from the fortune he made from publishing that magazine, as I recall, he was a huge devotee of Mahler, and in particular Mahler's Seventh Symphony, the Adagietto, where he actually ended up buying the original score from the Mahler family. And if I do remember correctly, he trained himself to be, what a wonderful thing to do autodidactically, trained himself to be a conductor of full-scale symphony orchestras, and used to conduct that Adagietto and various other pieces by traveling around the world with all the world's major symphony orchestras. What a fascinating thing that you could do with the money that you've acquired from a publishing empire. Not sure it would happen in the modern age, but then on the other hand, not sure you'd make that amount of money out of a print publication either, as you say, Jeff. I mean, quite incredible, quite different times.
I did not know Gil in that company, but he and I did share some devotion to Mahler, coincidentally.
Ah.
And I met him and spoke with him many times on that subject, as well as what I was working on at II, which he followed even though he was no longer there. So that's an interesting tangent we could go on. But
there's a fascinating tangent. It could occupy a very interesting. If we get down to In Patrick's Listens or something like that, IPL or IPM in Patrick's music, we might start that as another series, and we'll get a few other famous parishioners of the exchange world on. We can have John Macchionis, the retired deputy CEO of the IPE, talking about his Wagner obsession or something. But anyway, so you were an institutional investor. Fascinating time. Yes, they were. I totally agree, in the forefront of developing a great deal of content around the developing nexus of technology and finance and institutional investment and so on. And you also worked at Securities Industry News. When was that?
It was affectionately known as SIN. I took a couple years away from II and then went back. This was 2004-5 era. They hired me to, I guess they were trying to revitalize it in some way, but it happened to be a boom time for trading, especially the move on the sell side to raise their technology game. And there was a lot of talk of multi-asset trading, which was relatively young at the time. that was an interesting place to be. SIN, Securities Industry News, was owned by Source Media, which was also the then unit that American Banker was part of. So I coincidentally went back to the old stamping ground. And I stayed there for a couple of years, left and went back to II. And at some point, the market turned against Securities Industry News and they folded it into something else.
That was such a shame, because actually Securities Industry News was one of those particular publications that had an incredible era, I would say from probably the mid-90s through, as you say, through the mid-2000s, when its circulation was never that huge. But if you worked in the securities industry, the market infrastructure, processing, and really, and therefore using technology, perhaps not developing it, everybody seemed to read it. And I remember that so well, because I'd almost never heard of it until I landed in New York. Actually, I landed in San Francisco, first of all, and found my phone was buzzing because SIN had done an article about my first book, Capital Market Revolution. And actually, it was the single article that probably got the most publicity for that book ever in terms of direct contact, which is incredible when you think about the same book was on Sky TV, BBC TV, lots of major league channels. It was in the Financial Times. It had huge write-ups elsewhere. And yet it was actually SIN that really was effectively the G-spot nexus of the technology use case scenario in financial markets processing at that time. And that's why I have a very fond memory for it. And it's so sad that I don't quite know what happened, that things went awry, but it just lost its way along the line in the later 2000s.
Well, that brings to mind something that is probably common to us in the journalism profession. We like it when people read our stuff, and we like to know that they do. And you're right about SIN. Whatever the numbers were, we got the sense that people were reading it, and we got feedback.
Yeah.
We knew it was there. I had that same experience at II, by the way, institutional investor.
I can totally believe that.
I
totally believe that. I mean, I think II had incredible reach as well. I mean, it has had as a publication, no argument.
Yeah, I don't want to cast aspersions about American Banker, because it had its impact, especially in the hinterlands. It went to everybody. And I might go to a conference sometime and everybody will say, "Oh, you're the one who wrote that," or that sort of thing. But the way that demographic worked, you didn't get immediate feedback. You put stuff out in the world, and you knew people got it, but you wondered what their reactions were. As over time, you start developing relationships, you hear from people, you have conversations. But in the capital markets world, or I don't know however you want to define the space, there's dialogue there. The people react, you hear from them. And it happens, I noticed it at II immediately, and it happened at SIN. And to some extent, it's still happening as I got into the risk management world.
Well, certainly, I mean, going to GARP, and I totally agree with you. I think Institutional Investor and SIN had incredible user interaction. And I think American Banker is amazing, but it's just that given the huge number of people who read it, it doesn't necessarily feel quite as if you got so much per head or per capita in terms of the interaction. But so you went into the world of risk management. You arrived at GARP. Now, that's a fascinating organization of, let's say, somewhat nerdy individuals who are fascinated by the entire world of risk. And you got there just as we were going through another exciting revolution in how people thought about risk.
Yes, the crisis of '98 changed a lot of things when it comes to risk and risk culture. And I was frankly brought in because they wanted to GARP, this association, which was doing very well because of the demand for risk and risk education and risk talent. They wanted to make a position statement that this is not just for nerds. risk management is to be a mainstream concern that people can speak English about and communicate real ideas and accomplish real things with. And it's not just about equations and Greek letters. And GARP had a longstanding academic style review. It came out quarterly. They just simply redesigned and rebranded it. And that's when I came in. And we changed the content. We created a new mix of content. So it was more like a magazine. We continued to have some of the quantitative and more academic features, but for the most part, they were so-called back of the book. And in the front of the book, we put people and feature articles and guest pieces and things like that, but op-eds, and in a glossy format. And I think it served a purpose. It connected with more people in more mainstream ways without dumbing down what the subject matter was. And risk management in that time period, the early 2000s, the early 2010s, risk management became so mainstream and so in demand that it got to the point where chief risk officers not only got a seat at the table in the executive suite, which they didn't have several years before, but chief risk officers they sit alongside CFOs and COOs, and there are some people who still believe that CROs have made the leap to become candidates for CEO positions when they open up. It might be a bit arguable, or it needs to be, that discussion needs to be a bit more nuanced. But the fact is, CROs have achieved parity with, or a peer relationship with, people they once were not peers of.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think also, if I may say so, you're possibly slightly underselling your legacy at GARP, because I completely agree with you. I mean, the original GARP academic style of journal which came out, which were incredibly worthy and thoroughly useful for many people. But frankly, I mean, for someone like me who actually has traded a great deal in his life and has endeavored to do a great deal to manage their risk, what I discovered was that I could understand the Greek letters as a result of 3 years of learning ancient Greek as a schoolboy. But other than that, it all seemed rather bamboozling. Whereas actually your ability to break down a lot of the serious topics and put it on the agenda was really, really important. And I think that's something that, for example, was writ large in the 2007, 2008 crash and crisis. And my absolute favorite tale there, which I think I've already said on this story, but I'm going to say it again. You know, Prue Leith, who's one of Britain's most famous chefs, television presenter. She presents Britain's pretty much most sacred program, the Great British Bake Off. She was famously invited to be a director, I think it was VHBOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland. And she went to the board and she read all the board papers. And they'd given her this 150, 200 page declaration of derivatives risk and what had gone on. And it was utter gobbledygook from start to finish. And she tried to read it about 5 times and she just gave up. So she sat down and she sits down at her first board meeting, puts this out. The director next to hers, he sets his out, but his is a completely virgin, untouched copy. And she looks at him and she says, I tried to read that. It's completely impossible. I don't understand a thing. And this guy just looked at her in sort of a rather sad and patronizing way and mansplained to the effect of, well, no, neither do I understand what it says. But, you know, these are the people who are making us money, and sort of patted the pile of papers. And she came to the conclusion, which was an absolutely pragmatic, I think, GARP story of risk. She just looked at this and thought, if nobody understands what somebody's doing, I don't think we're in a great position in terms of risk. And she very politely made her excuses and left the board about 6 months later. And obviously, as we know, HBOS imploded into a crater that probably got closer to the center of the earth than even the incredible boring machine of Elon Musk. So you know, there's a lot you did there, which really helped I wouldn't say popularize risk, but certainly managed to break down a lot of the barriers and helped the risk industry really communicate, which is vital stuff.
Any profession suffers if it becomes too insular, and where the professionals develop their own language and they don't talk to people who really need to know what they are doing and how it relates to the bigger picture. And communication skills, or the ability to impart technical information in a way that relates to what a corporation is actually doing in terms of performance, is now a skill that's it's required of people who get hired into the risk profession, and that's part of the GARP mission, is to help cultivate those skills in addition to the technical ones. And yeah, I would agree that we've come a long way, and I'd like to think GARP had a good deal to do with that change in the culture.
I think you're right. I think GARP had a great deal to do with that change in the culture. Absolutely. So if we look at that, and I mean, therefore, let's just complete your next move so we get through your whole career arc. So recently you have joined the fine folks of TabbFORUM. I think you know the boss there and have done for many years. Tell us a little bit about that and some of the interesting reports that you've been doing, Jeff.
For TabbFORUM, which is named for the great market structure analyst Larry Tabb, who is no longer there, but friendly with all of us, of course. The group, the current group at Tabb, which is led by Bruce Morris, is wanted to do something that was not. It was kind of along the lines of what I did at II in those rankings. They wanted to call attention to innovators in the financial markets and capital markets with an award program. And last year, in the early part of last year, we developed something called the TabbFORUM 40, where we named 40 individuals, spotlighted 40 people, many of them leaders or CEOs of large enterprises, but not all large. And there was a diverse mix of people and companies represented, but people who are making a difference in their leadership and in their accomplishments with technology-driven innovation in the financial space. I mean, there were some of the usual suspects you could guess, the heads of NASDAQ and Intercontinental Exchange and DTCC, big infrastructure. But there were also other players at banks and technology companies that made the list. One person on it who was maybe a little off the beaten track, if we think about it, but certainly has a lifetime of achievement in this area, was Richard Sandor, whose latest venture is American Financial Exchange and the Ameribor LIBOR alternative rate. He was recognized in the TabbFORUM 40. We diversified with a new product or a new project this year, the TabbFORUM Nova Awards, or Tab Novas, TabbFORUM Novas, NOVA, which was just released in the early part of this month. And this highlights or named companies as opposed to individuals. The TabbFORUM 40 were people, TabbFORUM Novas are companies. And again, we have a diversified mix of companies by size. And we added to this 10 up and coming ones. We call them 10 more innovators to watch. A lot of them touch on crypto. And talk about a tangent we can go off. Bitcoin is probably being written off as a real thing for many people in this industry, but blockchain is not. And there's tremendous amount of blockchain related innovation now taking place, and I think it's gonna stick for a while.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I mean, that brings us elegantly to that elephant in the room that we've been talking about so much in all fora in recent times, Bitcoin, distributed ledger, and so on. And I mean, how do you view it in terms of these huge technological changes that you've seen, such as ATMs, the rise of the internet, the rise of mobile cellular phones, and all of what that's done for finance? Where do you think crypto currently sits and distributed ledger? And I think you can split the two in terms of their importance amongst technological innovations.
I think the jury is definitely still out on those questions. There are people who say that this is the biggest thing since the internet. If you take the whole picture into account, this is part of Web3 or metaverse or whatever it's going to morph into. And get on the bandwagon now, or else you're going to be left behind. I am generally sympathetic that we're into something big and big changes are in the works, and it's going to revolve around the blockchain or derivative ledger, distributed ledger technology as it evolves, or as utility is found for it. But I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And how it fits into the coming metaverse or whatever is developing is still to be seen. I was struck by several public comments made by establishment leaders in financial services in the wake of the FTX debacle and the crypto winter and the general talk that Bitcoin or some of its siblings are going to be regulated out of existence or made a lot more less valuable than they have even been recently. And this leaves aside the fact that Bitcoin's value has rebounded from the bottom, but that's another discussion. In the wake of Sam Bankman-Fried and all that, several people, and I can name names, Larry Fink, David Solomon of Goldman Sachs, among them, have said there's even Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. They've all allowed that there is an opening for distributed ledger technology to persist and grow and change a lot of aspects of capital markets operations. The CEO of Bank of New York Mellon, who's Robin Vince, recently said, there's no money in this immediately, but we're investing in it for the future, because to not do so would be to be living at a time when it was not a good idea to buy computers for your banking operations. So I listened to that, and it sounds like something of a consensus that distributed ledger technology is something that might pay off down the road, if it's not already beginning. I think we do see some applications that work. On the other hand, we saw a couple that failed miserably. We could talk about ASX in Australia, which had to write off their early investment in DLT to great embarrassment.
What do you think was the root of the problem with that ASX digital asset distributed ledger project that has failed to replace chess, which was a wonderful system when it was introduced, but that's getting on for 35 years ago now?
I don't know every detail about that case study, but I would raise the question about quality of management and whether they were on top of what was going on there. That was a major system replacement, obviously, and projects like that cannot be underestimated in terms of their magnitude. And somewhere along the line, promises were made that were not kept. Maybe it was a premature decision. They hooked up with digital asset at a rather early stage and were a major boost to digital assets' early reputation. And digital asset today is doing okay in the way that they've repositioned themselves. It's not all about replacing existing back office infrastructure with the distributed ledger, but execution failed in that case. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that many projects just don't work in this business. They don't make headlines because they're kept internal and the news doesn't get out. But technology projects fail quite often. And here's one that
indeed, sorry to interrupt, but the one thing is that when we come to security settlement, there is a rich history of not just failure, but absolutely spectacular cratering failure that makes Howard Hughes's Spruce Goose look like a fabulous aircraft. I mean, you think about the 1980s when the London Stock Exchange was supposed to bring in, what was it, Taurus, which turned out to be just the most appalling disaster imaginable. And then the Bank of England had to take the whole thing over and actually pulled settlement away from the London Stock Exchange itself, which was a total national travesty. And yeah, you're right. I mean, ASX's replacement for Chess was just a supreme disaster. It'll be very interesting to see how digital assets installations go with the likes of Hong Kong exchanges, which are coming up in the near future as well, amongst other clients. And yeah, quite fascinating. One for the case books and case studies for many years to come, I think, Jeff. So, I mean, when you're looking at this whole thing, what's your perception, though, stepping away? Digital assets, distributed ledger, I think it's a great, fascinating future, will be incredible. What about this whole miasma of crypto? Because, I mean, we talk about it as bit carnage and exchange invest. It's certainly the crypto winter continues, but it looks to me like the crypto crackdown is almost trying to destroy most everything in the Bitcoin universe.
Cryptocurrencies are looking problematic, to say the least, because they haven't established what they are. Are they, that whole question about store of value and whether they are a payment system advance, and what is it good for? There have been some very interesting and articulate commentaries on how cryptocurrencies haven't established what they're good for, and it's a jumble of a lot of different kinds of companies, and some do this and some do that, and some do too much and some do too little. If you go back to the original formulation of Satoshi Nakamoto, he saw it as a payment substitute, or a new generation, or taking replacement for fiat currency in the payments world. And if they stuck to that and pilot tested it and treated it like a business, it might have told us more than what it went on instead, which was it was open source, and it was decentralized, and it was just a jumble of events that have never hit the ground running in one consistent way. I wouldn't discount the possibility that cryptocurrency can come through this in some form. It's going to be regulated in some way. But it was pointed out by some analysts that in the recent events where regulators are cracking down on certain products like, what is it, BUSD, the Binance Connected stablecoin, which was issued by Paxos. That doesn't look like it has much of a approved future now. But as those things got closed off, investors or the public that was involved in these stablecoin alternatives, they moved to Bitcoin, or they moved to Ethereum, and they caused the value, the quotes on Bitcoin and Ethereum to go back up, and that might explain why they have recovered from their bottoms. So there's enough there to follow and to consider what happens next. But in perspective, it's not going to bring down the global financial system in its current state.
No, it does look as if El Salvador might be somewhat out on a limb there as the country with it as their reserve currency. Although I realize there are a few other countries of even less economic might that are talking about that. But the other thing that strikes me is it's just like that Bitcoin is fabulous as having been kind of the Model T Ford of cryptocurrency. I mean, it started off what may yet prove to be a Copernican revolution in finance, but it's really only the staging post, because right now, if you hand anybody the keys this afternoon as they're driving out of the office, wherever you're still allowed to actually drive cars without being shot down or paying some sort of hideous charge for being downtown, nobody will want to drive the Ford Model T. They'll always want to drive their Ford Yaris or their Toyota Yaris or their Ford 150 or whatever it is, even though pretty much 80-90% of the DNA of the Ford Model T is in whatever you're driving on the road today. And that seems to me to be the problem of Bitcoin itself, is that it's a wonderful and exciting thing, but it too probably spears off into being its own little hobbying equestrian holiday or shortwave radio for the masses of a certain group of people who are interested in what could have been the future of money once.
You and I discussed this at one point, Patrick, that the technology itself that was deployed by the likes of Binance and FTX and Coinbase, it really wasn't all that breakthrough. They wanted to project that they were doing something new and better than the established financial system, but it was version 1.0, and it needs to be better than that.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where we sit in terms of the cryptocurrency revolution at the moment, is that V1.0 is probably going to be regulated to near death. Now what we have to do is go back and look at, well, something that you covered actually in Institutional Investor in the period of 2000-2001, which was the rise of the B2B exchanges, which were going to be the whole future of the world. And indeed, the Futures Industry Association Boca Raton Conference was so devoted to B2B discussions in 2000 AD that they even had their own B2B conference in Boston later that year in 2000 AD. And then actually Enron went bust, a few other people went bust, and actually there were no survivors apart from, there was some business, it was called Intercontinental Exchange. Wonder whatever happened to it. I think that was the only thing ever survived out of the B2B revolution. I sort of feel, I don't know about you, that's how I sort of feel about crypto version 1.0, is that all these names that we've lived with ubiquitously over the course of the last few years could just disappear. And I think FTX already has.
I think there's a lesson in there that we have to be wary of crazes, and when everybody seems to be on board with the same ideas, it usually comes to a bad end. I have a personal recollection which taught me a lot, which was in that B2B timeframe, I met Jeff Sprecher, who was then just beginning to bring Intercontinental Exchange into view on a more global basis, and Enron was flying, or maybe it just stopped flying so high. But being where I was, I heard a lot about how incredible their B2B technology was, their trading systems and such, and how they were pointing the way toward a different kind of trading future. And I said to Sprecher, is any of that true? Do they really are they set apart technologically, if not by some other matters that are more problematic? And he scratched his head for a minute and said, "I don't think so." It's a lot of hype
I
there.
think it's a great story. But then on the other hand, the great thing about that is that story, when you met Jeff Sprecher, if everybody had been cryogenically frozen at that month or a few months earlier and brought back 20 years later and told, one B2B exchange still exists, and actually it now owns the New York Stock Exchange, everybody who'd just woken up Woody Allen style, like in Sleeper, would have been scratching their head for a minute and go, well, okay, so it was Enron, right? No. It was like Dynagen. No. It was, True. It was, and they go through a whole list of probably names, and actually none of them would reach Intercontinental Exchange, because Intercontinental Exchange was kind of maybe sixth, maybe seventh, maybe eighth out of a multiplicity of B2B exchanges. And I mean, no doubt about it, Jeff Sprecher is the finest entrepreneur in market infrastructure in history, as he's proven repeatedly. But it's a fascinating lesson to draw from that. And actually drawing that lesson, Jeff, I'm afraid we've pretty much occupied our entire hour of discussion with this fascinating journey with Jeff Kutler from ATMs to cryptocurrencies. So it's come to the final question. And I want to ask you, Jeffrey, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
At risk of making it sound like I'm on a bandwagon ahead of its time, I think that we should look at artificial intelligence and what it is capable of contributing to the capital market's future. I am under no illusion that it's where it needs to be. Chat GPT is overhyped, and we got to figure that stuff out. But what I do have some faith in is in smart people acting proactively to understand AI innovation and govern it correctly and apply it in constructive ways. And as examples, some academic institutions like Stanford has the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Unit program. Very smart. Some of the smartest people in AI work there. And they're connecting it to civilization. It's not just blue sky stuff. Cambridge University has the Center for the Study of Existential Risks. I think they're applying to this subject necessary and constructive thinking. And if you put all that kind of stuff together, I think there's a future to AI, and I think it's going to have a positive impact if we learn from it and learn from these people and listen to the right people and apply it well.
And on that note, I think that's a great point to end. I totally agree with you. I think ChatGPT is horribly overhyped, but at the same time, it's that sort of breakthrough drug which hopefully helps us to get to the next level of understanding AI in the mainstream. Just don't share your confidential financial information with ChatGPT, as indeed the good folks in risk at JP Morgan began talking about just in the course of the last week or so. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a fabulous show. Next week, we're moving on with Albert Menkfeld. He's a professor, one of the leading market infrastructure, if not the leading market infrastructure professor in Europe. We're going to discuss non-standard errors in markets. Threatens to be a fabulously exciting show altogether. That's going to be March 7 p.m. CET, usual time. Let me just say one huge word of thanks to our excellent guest today, Jeffrey Kutler. It has been a pleasure discussing this huge raft of financial innovations all the way from the course of the ATM through to cryptocurrencies. Thank you very much to our brilliant production team today, to Marianne, Richellen, and Janella. My name is Patrick L. Young, wishing you a great week in blockchain, life, and markets. We'll be back